I want to introduce now our next speaker, the Honourable Michael Kirby, former Justice of the High Court. His work convinced him of the need for a radical revision of drug law policy to align with universal human rights, proportionality and justice.
Thank you very much, Stan, for being here with us tonight. You're always good for a request for a good cause, and I appreciate it and express my thanks to you. I too acknowledge the Indigenous people, the First Nations people, right across our country. Great injustices have been done, and to some extent are still being done to the Indigenous people, often by the law. And there are lessons to be learned from context. The context in Australia of a legal system that often penalises people excessively and in ways that are inconsistent with their human rights. I thank Greg Chipp for organising us to come together tonight. I honour Bob Carr, who's often been involved in these conferences that I've attended at Parliament House, where he once bestrode the narrow world like a colossus. And I honour all the participants and all you who've come out on a cold night to consider a very important issue. Now, Greg Chipp has started with a personal story, and I don't want to sort of start a tradition in this night's encounter, but I have to say that I am an almost totally drug-free person. I don't know where drug users get the time to use drugs, and certainly in the sort of jobs that I have had, particularly in the judicial jobs, I had very little time, and I had to focus every day, very long hours, and it just would not have been possible even if I had been so inclined. I confess to a certain curiosity about it all, but it's a curiosity I have slaked with an occasional, not very often, glass of champagne and an occasional cup of tea and a cup of coffee. Now, this is not said to be a boast. It's probably a reflection on my life of abstinence and discipline. But there it is. So on our panel, we've got a person whose experience has been that of Greg Chipp, and a person like me whose experience has been different. But I met drug offenders. Well, I didn't actually meet them. I met their problems and their cases in the courts, specifically in the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal, where I sat for 12 years, and in the High Court of Australia, where I sat for 13 years. And during those 25 years, I had a lot of cases involving drug use in the criminal law, and probably the second most prolific visitors to the courts after migrants and refugees. There were plenty of them, especially in the High Court. But I somehow do understand the predicament of drug users in Australia, because when I was reaching puberty, I discovered that I was gay. And I discovered very soon afterwards in the criminal law class at the Sydney Law School that there were really nasty and extremely heavy penalties upon Australians, even if they were law-abiding and very drug-abstemious, for their sexual orientation and gender identity. There are still various disadvantages, but ultimately people stood up and things started to change. But what I want to do is to set a scene for this discussion tonight, and it's a scene that tries to tell us where we've come from and where we are, because unless we understand those features, we're not going to really know where we're going and how we can get there. In the middle of the 19th century, there was a meeting of citizens of the United States of America in the state of Maine. They were conservative people. There were probably many Methodists amongst them, and they decided that they should move to secure a change of the state and then the national constitution to prohibit the possession and distribution of alcohol. And that led ultimately to the Prohibition in the United States in, I think it was in 1917 or 18, under the 18th Amendment to that country's constitution, and it led ultimately to the 31st Amendment to the Constitution that led to the repeal of the 18th Amendment. So a small group of people meeting together with intelligence can do amazing things. And the United States ultimately threw off the Prohibition, but after a lot of suffering and a lot of criminalisation and a lot of ineffective laws, but they did so in their own domestic jurisdiction by the amendment to the Constitution. They didn't do so in the international sphere, where they continued to follow a prohibitionist approach. The League of Nations, soon after the 18th Amendment that introduced prohibition in the United States, included a special branch and a special initiative to prevent the trafficking of women, children, and illicit drugs. And that was the importation into the international sphere of the prohibitionist model that had originated in the state of Maine. And soon after the League of Nations was established, important treaties began to be enacted on international level for the purpose of prohibiting the possession and distribution and use of illicit drugs. And I've got here with me a very interesting book that was presented to me by Rick Lines, who is a wonderful writer in this subject which we're talking about tonight. It's called Drug Control and Human Rights in International Law, and it talks exactly about the issue that Stan has raised, and that is how we balance two great streams which have followed in international law since the League of Nations. Stream number one is the prohibitionist model on illicit drugs. And with respect, Greg, it didn't begin in 1961. It began in 1925 with the first legislation against dangerous drugs, and then the Convention against heroin specifically, and then a convention of the League of Nations against narcotic drugs. And those were the first steps on the path to an international pressure upon nations to introduce laws of their own and enforce laws of their own against their own citizens and others on the basis that they were using or distributing, selling illicit drugs. Our question that we have been posed tonight is it time to legalise drugs? Well, the answer to that question is obviously yes. But what I'm presenting to you is an impediment that lies in the path of any radical alteration in national laws, and that impediment are the series of treaties, first of all of the League of Nations, and then of the United Nations against narcotic and other drugs. Now, the United Nations took over the office of the League of Nations to combat trafficking in drugs. But not very long after the establishment of the United Nations in 1948, that great woman, Eleanor Roosevelt, chaired a committee which introduced and adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And a very great Australian, Dr. H.V. Evatt, was the president of the General Assembly of the United Nations when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948, December the 10th, I think it is, 1948. And when that great treaty came into force, the world was faced with a visible example of the conflict which it hasn't yet been able to resolve. And that conflict is between the pathway of prohibition and criminal laws and sanctions and the pathway of universal human rights. And the pathway of universal human rights came to the fore when the HIV epidemic struck the world. I see in the audience Bill Botel, who was serving on the staff in the Labor government of Bob Hawke, and I honour and acknowledge the important work that he and that government and Neil Blewett and Peter Boehm of the Liberal Party did to combat the spread of HIV by embracing the AIDS paradox, which was the best way to stop the spread of HIV is by reaching out to, embracing, consulting, involving, and then doing things that inform people, educate people about certain practices that may increase their vulnerability, and that became, in a sense, the Australian model. And it was very relevant to people who inject drugs, because people who inject drugs, PWID, were people who were extremely vulnerable to becoming infected with HIV. And indeed, about 1 in 6 of the people who were infected with HIV in the early days were people who injected drugs. And that presented the quandary of how to reconcile the Prohibitionist approach on drugs, which was strongly supported by conservative politicians, not just in the Liberal Party, but also in the Labor Party, and by police commissioners. But it was the view of the United Nations, and I took a very small part in the development of that view, that the best way to deal with the problem was not to prohibit, not to use criminal laws, but to involve and emphasise education. And the net result of that was that the country in the world that led the way to introduce needle exchange in the area of HIV and for the purposes of HIV containment was New Zealand. It did so about 2 years before we did it in Australia. We followed New Zealand. It's a feisty little country, New Zealand. They often do lots of very good things, and they do it quickly because they've got a simpler constitutional setup. But in New Zealand and Australia today, we have about 1% or 2% of our citizens with HIV. And a lot of the explanation for that goes to abandoning the criminal model in punishing people who inject drugs as the strategy for HIV and taking the human rights model. In Canada, the rate of infection in people who inject drugs was 18%, because it was very variable during in the different provinces of Canada, and in other countries, in Russia, it's about 50%. Depending on whether you adopted the Prohibitionist model, you got very bad results. And if you adopted the engagement model and the education model, you got better results. And that is what introduced the appreciation of the fact that we've reached a time to change from concentration on the first model, the Prohibitionist model, and to look at how we can introduce principles of proportionality and human rights in dealing with the issues that are presented by use of drugs relevant to HIV, also relevant to hepatitis, and fortunately we have on our panel tonight Alex Wodak, who's done such wonderful work in spreading this message in Australia and has important work now before him. There will be people who will speak tonight on the very important reforms that are being presented in Canada and elsewhere. There is a problem with some of those reforms, and the problem is that it can be argued that they're not consistent with some of the international treaties that Australia has signed, and they may need to be reviewed. There certainly will be pressure placed upon Australia in international circles to limit the reforms because of our international commitments to the bevy of conventions that we have ratified as a country. So this is something that needs to be considered, because you can consider for yourself that it's time to legalise drugs, but there will be a lot of people in the international sphere who will be demanding that Australia stick to its international law obligations. So that's the context in which we meet. There are two big paths, and we are at the confluence of them. The path of prohibition and criminal law, and the path of universal human rights law. And I have no doubt which is the path we should take, but it has an international dimension, and we have to keep our eye on that. Otherwise, we may find our endeavours nipped in the bud.
Drug Policy Australia is a fully tax-deductible charity. If you'd like to help save our young people from the harms of prohibition, please visit the donation page on our website. Thank you.